Buenos días a todos los que están conectados a este tercer día de conversatorios de Arquitectura 2020, evento realizado por Construcciones Planificadas, la W Radio y con el respaldo del Grupo Aval. El conversatorio de hoy se hará en inglés. Las personas podrán enviarnos sus preguntas a través de Facebook Live La W o a través de YouTube. For me, it's a privilege to present today's guests. Preston Scott Cohen is the Gerald McHugh Professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he was the chair of the architectural 2008-2013. He is the founding principal of Preston Scott Cohen, Inc., an international renowned architect firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, celebrated for its innovative geometry and its original approach to integrate new buildings with their urban and natural environment. Among the firm's most celebrated buildings are the Tel Aviv Museum of Art's Amir Building, the Taiwan Museum of Art in China, Tauman College at the University of Michigan. Awards and honors include his induction as the academical at the National Academy of Arts, the award in architecture from American Academy of Arts and Letters, 5 Progressive Architectural Awards, and first prizes in 8 international architecture competitions around the world. Good morning to a friend of Construcciones Planificadas. Hello, Scott.
Well, hello. First, I would just really like to thank you, Mauricio, and to Sonia Sarmiento for inviting me today. This is a wonderful opportunity to share ideas about various issues on my mind regarding what I've been working on. I'm going to discuss the way in which architecture is shaped by the city, because I believe so much of what has happened to it, particularly in this last century and until today, is determined by the city, and so much of what will happen will be because of what happens to the city. The city I always use to think about this issue, of course, is the city that has meant the most to me, always, New York. It's a very useful paradigm for thinking about these issues. I'm going to just focus on a very simple idea about architecture and the reciprocal relationship it has with the city. Here, what you obviously see first and foremost is this remarkable void in the center, a gigantic room in the center of the city. I want you to look at that on the one hand, and I want you to look very far in the distance and look at the way the city is so irregularly shaped at the very end, at the bottom of Manhattan Island. Those two aspects of it are what I'm going to be talking the most about and how they have infected the way I think as an architect. So when we think about these giant room in the middle of the city, it's remarkable then to scale down and to look at other great rooms, outdoor rooms in the city. We have on the left here, Bryant Park. And we have on the right, we have the park in front of Grand Central. May I ask though, Mauricio, can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So these two outdoor spaces, they become significant in the way in which they replace parts of the grid. But what I want to talk about is the way in which they are analogous to great interior rooms. And it is this analogy between outdoor rooms and indoor rooms that is so important. First, let's look at the way these giant rooms are made. They exert a great deal of pressure on the city. Grand Central even exceeds the limits of our view as we approach it. But Mauricio, I am hearing from people that they cannot see my screen, actually. They do not see the slides.
Let me see it.
Mauricio.
Yes. I am.
Someone is saying
that they cannot see the screen.
I don't know, but I hope they can. Someone is alerting me. One moment. Can you see?
Chevy, ¿me ayudas ponchando el screen, porfa? Parece que no se está viendo la pantalla de la presentación.
Okay, now they can see it.
Okay, perfect.
So, I'm talking about the idea of large rooms, important in shaping the city, and the analogy to great interior rooms. It is this reciprocity between architecture as it makes great rooms and the way the city itself forms great rooms that I'm most interested in. So here, a great interior room, Grand Central. Here, a great exterior room, Bryant Park. Just as important as the great reading room in the library next to it. This analogy between rooms, inside and outside, this is one issue. The other issue I want to tell you about that matters so much to me is the way the city shapes buildings in very specific ways in these very exceptional sites that happen in the city. Buildings are distorted by the form of the city, and the city is shaped by the buildings themselves. This is the Flatiron Building, like a hinge that pries Broadway away from Fifth Avenue. Look at the way it distorts and transforms the plan of a typical skyscraper. And now we look at the Barclay-Vasey Building in Lower Manhattan. It's a parallelogram in plan. And you see just beyond it, the great Woolworth Building, which is the orthogonal version of the Barclay-Vasey. The Barclay-Vasey is like a distorted axonometric drawing, in a way, of a more typical, idealized building. You can see how the plan is wrapped by the plan of the city. The interior articulations, even to the level of details, are struggling with the negotiation between what has to happen to various rooms and how the whole building is shaped according to being part of the city. This reciprocity between rooms inside and out and the way buildings are formed to be part of the city. These are two ideas that have been shaping all of the work I've been doing. Let's look at a remarkable thing that happens when a very different paradigm of urban interior space is made by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a space that brings into it another idea, even more important, one could say, than the great rooms of New York, which is the sidewalk. The sidewalk is extended into the interior and becomes the means to move through a great room to rise up into this enormous room to witness all of the art and people in it. So he has made a room out of the sidewalks of the city, one continuous spiraling sidewalk. This is such a deeply inspiring idea to draw the city into and reform architecture in this way, creating a whole new paradigm for the museum. This is the moment when the city transforms what an institution really is. In this sense, for the first time, we have the gallery, the giant cabinet of curiosity, a kind of single room that collects so many things and becomes scaled in a wholly new way. This was the inspiration for the first project. I will show you the Tel Aviv Museum that Mauricio mentioned to you. It's exciting to have art and people together conjoined with an experience of movement and to bring light into a building in this way. It's a building that needed to be this way because it is very tightly packed in the city, shaped by the city in the way a building like the Flatiron is. A building so compacted and establishing a sequence all around it to the plazas and gardens around it. And then on the inside, because it is so deeply embedded in the ground, half underground, it is burying many of the galleries, and a light well is developed that will turn and reflect light all the way down to the lowest reaches of the building. And so when we are discovering this space, we're actually in the middle of it when we arrive, halfway between what is above and below the ground. And we're captivated by this interior experience in a way unmoored and disconnected from the normal life of the city. This is because the plans are stacking up and rotating to different angles to adjust themselves to the site, producing this idealized form at the heart of the building, which becomes a new way to exhibit art. You will see many wonderful artists have responded to this space, doing critical installations, even an installation that totally radically alters the building as a critique of the building. This one by Mahama. A building in Bogota. Great project, enjoying so much to work with Mauricio and his team at Construcciones Planificadas. It has been an incredible experience. Again, a building which is compacted by the site very densely. The site could barely support a performing center of the scale that we wished to put here. And so, like Tel Aviv, something very exceptional had to happen. The first thing was to lift the building and to create an enormous interior lobby that flows directly in from the plaza. This displacement, this lifting of the theater becomes something that makes it very distinguished from other performing centers of this kind, because we move into it and discover a sequence of such power and drama. And we rise up into a plan that's constantly changing, as Tel Aviv's does, but in a very different way, very organically compacting the theater into a very complex and interesting sequence of lobbies and public spaces for people as they move up to a second theater. And you will see that this drama of the section is reformulated inside the primary performing space itself. But it is this corner, this exceptional moment where two cylinders are rotated and only touching on a single point. Two very extraordinary staircases, one to ascend and one to descend. Very effective for social distancing. The one-way experience of going up and coming down. And the two stairs creating a kind of exceptional and continuous form. Now I must tell you that this is an incredible experience to work on. Carl Dworkin in my office has modeled all of this to a very high degree, first in Rhino, then transformations through scripting in Grasshopper and moving it into Revit and working with Santiago at Planificadas. It's been a very intense experience to understand how the parametric kind of formation of the interrelation between the facade and the internal dynamics of the form that are compressed by the city have played out, like a curtain opening. Here you will see transformations of the facade and how it was developed to be idealized into a series of panels that can be of a certain type and reduced in numbers of types to give it efficiency, even as it appears to be very complex. It is made of very few standard types of panels. This is another part of our effort to try to negotiate complexity with efficiency and standardization. The problem of thinking about the drama of the interrelation between the site and the interior space that gives life to the institution moves out of the city, but the same sensibility continues. Here at the Taubman College at the University of Michigan, we have this very enormous existing building to which we are adding this exceptional smaller piece. And this piece has within it a very unusual space, a dramatic atrium, which turns the building in the site, reorients it toward the street, reaching it, stretching toward it. And here you see a kind of interesting resemblance to Sawtooth warehouses and factories that are part of that context in Michigan. But it is this enormous and interesting atrium that I want you to look at, and the way by being a six-sided shape can pivot the building into this very specific position to establish a sequence through in the context, and really interestingly establish a new center to a building that never had an interior center. This great room now is the social center of the whole school, even though it's on the edge of this complex. Two ramps stacked and obliquely tilted, obviously, since they're sloping, and bound together by a single staircase. This kind of knot, again, like in Tel Aviv, providing the continuity between all of these levels with different experiences on each, very different programs and different geometries defining the levels. Again, the panelization that you see here is based in constraints to build that with a great efficiency, but within a very dynamic form, nonetheless, gives shape. You can see here in particular how the level of the laboratories on the left, very normative but stepping gradually upward, is bound to a very different world, which you see on the upper right. It almost looks like two buildings twisted over one another, just like Tel Aviv, but in a far more compacted way. The stair is very effective in creating this illusory experience of two buildings literally overlapped and turning relative to each other. Again, the study of light is so important here, the reflection of light, as in Tel Aviv, but in this case, to create this remarkable studio for the students. We actually tested the idea in our own studio in Cambridge, which has exactly the same angle and reflects light the same way, coincidentally. It becomes a forum, a place of great excitement for students, for events, changing the life of the school dramatically. And we've done numerous projects where a main room is the focus, the addition of a room to a building that hadn't had one before. This is an example for a museum in Italy. This is a really exciting project, again, multi-sided. Six-sided geometry, coincidentally, the transformation of a beautiful synagogue in Springfield, Massachusetts, Temple Bethel. Here, the transformation is much more subtle and powerful. We're looking at a building that had, on the left, you can see originally frontal seating. It was built in the mid-century when temples were very large in the United States. Today, we're trying to create a far more intimate environment. We are creating what we call a chapel within the sanctuary. This area for the services that occur weekly, the Shabbat services, is nested within the much larger context of a synagogue that can support the High Holy Days services, which are up to 600 people, and this smaller part only for around 100. And it's the very fine tuning of this part of the synagogue called the bima, and the way in which it becomes accessible by means of this ramp and the delicate railing and the form of its own special platform. that became very essential as we redefine the core of the space and make it concentric rings as opposed to frontal. The transformation from frontality to concentricity, of space in the round, this is a very powerful dialectic in architecture. To consider whether a space is about forward-facing orientation as opposed to moving in the round. Think back to Frank Lloyd Wright, a space very much developed in the round, and think of earlier museums, which are far more dedicated to the idea of sequentiality, frontal, and proceeding linearly. We are continuing with some of these ideas in a new synagogue in Kansas, this elliptical form. Again, trying to address how the High Holy Days and the chapel for this Shabbat services are connected to one another, nested within one another. One expands into the other. In this very organic form, nonetheless, ideally developed geometrically. Again, Carl is working very, very systematically to give this normal and regular form a basis in normal and regular components, even as it evokes the form of a Torah unscrolling or traditional Polish wooden synagogues with double domes. The complexity of the form is difficult to contend with within the economy that we're looking at here. But given the studies we're undertaking, we are reducing it to its essence. You can see that the ritual of the bima is very intricate here. The connection to the existing building is complex. The building has a very intense relationship with the ground, which is drawn into the interior. And this sense of the collectivity that's generated by that kind of form intensifies this experience of the chapel within it. And now scaling out, remembering this idea of the analogy of the great room of the city and the great interior room. You can see that while we were working on these two ellipses, this idea is very strong again. It's not so unlike imagining Bryant Park and the great reading room. Now we're talking about the design for an entire campus. This is an international bilingual school, K through 12 in Hefei, China. We designed the entire campus. It looks rather traditional to you, but this is a very radical idea for one reason, and that is because it has a single large yard in the middle of it. And this is not typical for these schools in China. Usually the yards are broken into much smaller parts and distributed. We've centralized it and given it greater presence and made it a collective space for the entire campus. It was thought that that would push the buildings too far apart. And the client was quite uncomfortable about it. But when we made this an element of connection, they began to become excited about it. And it is, of course, this canopy that becomes so significant. Remember the Guggenheim, the linearity of movement that defines a centralized space. We're doing that again, but of course, now we're on the outside and we're using it to connect the buildings and to accelerate movement and create excitement in that way. You can see how it exerts pressure on the buildings all around it, distorting them in a particular way, as if they are reciprocally formed by the urban idea. There again, that idea comes back. The city reciprocally forming architecture. And occasionally a coincidence occurs. This was just a little bit earlier, an oval yard again, but we are only on the edge of this yard, offering this very exceptional building, the auditorium, the performing center for this small campus in Beijing. A curtain lifting, but not in the same way it lifts in Bogota, and a very steeply inclined auditorium. Now to go back to New York, I want to shift to something, not only the street as the linear communicative social space, but the park, the linear park. we see the Riverside Park on the left here, and we see that it becomes the High Line on the lower left. But there was another idea to extend this to become interior. I want to show you also the linear parks of Boston. They're very powerful and beautiful, again by Olmsted. Winding their way through the city, they're offering a different way of moving through and connecting neighborhoods. Now the linear park has taken over many of the linear corridors of the city itself. The great streets are becoming parks. And it is that combination, that transformation, just as Wright transformed the museum by bringing the sidewalk into the museum environment, now we see nature moving into these linear streets and redefining them as parks in a way. We took this into the interior, at least as a concept, but keeping it outdoors. This is the Goldman Sachs Arcade. It's adjacent to the World Trade Center. After the 9/11 disaster, this whole area was redeveloped. And there was an idea to return to the traditional arcade in this environment. But an arcade, which is open air, we hadn't had those for quite some time in New York, and not in this part of the city, open air arcade. And thank goodness it is for COVID. And again, the linearity works well if it's regulated, the traffic through it. So we have the indoor lower ending to the High Line. It's the culmination, in a way, of this linear park across along the western side of the island into this corridor. It releases you into Battery Park, just south of here. This form is folded and is compressed by the buildings adjacent, which are bending. Again, a space that is shaped by the city. And you can feel that, the power of the city, which is forcing it to fold in its particular shape. That is the beauty of this space. It seems to be as much composed by the city as by a geometric idea. And this extends out, again, I'm moving out from the city with the same kind of thinking about it. A linear path across a bridge in Taiyuan will extend, extends and it develops a sequence through a museum. We pass through the building, but we remain outside of it with views of sculpture, gardens, and some hints of what's happening inside. This sequence is what shaped the geometry of the building. And you can see that the building seems even to be squeezed by this linear element, this linear ramp. And again, on the interior, an analogous idea. It's almost like another version of the outside on the inside, a ramping form. Another project in a kind of riverway. This is in another city in Western China. And you can see how the buildings tumble along this riverway-like face. This is just completed. That is actual building, not a model, though it looks like one. Kind of remarkable to see just freshly unveiled, having been scaffolded for about 3 years. This was quite a surprise to see. And now under construction, in this riverway along, actually running parallel with a much larger water, body of water, is the Science Center in Hefei, a building which turns inward and primarily is dedicated to the articulation of a space in which there is a very exceptional theater. It's a theater, of course, which is more than only a theater. And it also is a globe on the outside. It's a kind of incredibly interesting idea that we're still working with exhibit artists on. The geometry of this building developed around these very special moments, one of which will hold that theater as a sphere orbiting and implicitly orbiting around the building. And you'll see there how it occupies, even the way art occupies the light fall. This spherical element is thereby exhibited and given power in the building. This building has an exceptional impact in its scale, addressing a kind of territorial scope of space that it wishes to claim views of. It's really wonderful to see architecture foregrounding that remarkable expanse beyond. And finally, we're moving out completely, networking these arterial parks. Imagine a series of riverside parks or highlines lacing through a city. This is a plan for a new city. And these parkways, something like the Emerald Necklace in Boston, become a network for defining different districts. At a more localized scale, we are developing that for another campus. You can see how the negative space is moving through, even as there's a kind of rigid, almost Beaux-Arts plan. Nonetheless, the park is something more dynamic. The compression of this site, forcing, for example, the sports field to kind of invade the primary axis, as you see here on the right, disturbing the flow of this in an exciting way, so that it is a kind of synthesis between the picturesque Olmsted type of planning and the Beaux-Arts classical planning for campuses like this. Swelling and contracting spaces, crescents. I would say the inspiration here from London. And other projects in which we're embedding these exceptional courtyards, this idea of carving them not out of the city, but out of the landscape. This is a wonderful experiment to create courtyards in an entirely new way. And you see here the analogy between indoor and outdoor courtyards again. And I will just conclude by saying it's interesting always to scale architecturally, mentally, and to recognize the connections between urban and domestic space. We're all in a kind of landscape. And when we are in our homes, we find ourselves in contexts that are very much connected to the territorial scale. This is a house in California that assumes a similar form to that project in China, folded open, like a pyramid that was split and transformed. And you see that the rooms inhabit this like a deep wall embedded in it. These independent windows and spaces are all referencing one another, sequenced in an interesting way on the interior. Now, it looks like a gable. It looks like something evoking a traditional house, and that's because it does. You see this wide gable and you're remembering the idea of a gable, but the windows are doing something else. They're establishing these frames of for viewing a landscape independently, and they're bringing light in a very new way into these traditional forms. This is a house in New York that inspired the house in California that you just saw. All of these projects are linked together. They're part of a continuous research on a number of ideas. I'll just conclude by showing you this beautiful house in its setting, which speaks to this idea of the territorial scope and the territorial expanse, and the domestic experience of landscape, which I think is in a continuum with the city through all of those interrelationships. We can always remember where we are and how to trace ourselves back into urbanity from nature and vice versa. I just put some of these ideas out for you to consider, and I would love to hear your thoughts and questions, because that's the most interesting part for me. So thank you so much for allowing me to present these ideas.
Thank you, Scott, for this presentation. I think it's very interesting what you show us, the different projects and the different theories that you have about the urban and housing and the urban spaces, institutional spaces, like you show us. We're going to begin the question and answer talking about architecture. For this first question, what is architecture for Preston Scott Cohen?
That's a big question, Mauricio. I like that kind of question. You know, it's interesting. I've looked into this issue when I've thought about other architects. Many architects have come to a very simple statement about what they believe architecture to be. Corbusier said it is the magnificent play of light on form, for example. There are other architects. Louis Kahn said it was what the brick wants to be. One of the really interesting, two of the really interesting definitions. One is by Robert Venturi. He said, architecture is the struggle between the inside and the outside. I like that one. And another idea that I thought was brilliant, even though cynical a little bit, is Philip Johnson's definition. Architecture is the art of wasting space. It's a pretty interesting idea. You have to accept that waste has a value, or, this is a kind of negative value. I don't think he means it in the negative sense of waste. He means space that is not functional in the traditional way. It is the art of deploying that space. I once said that architecture, that architecture was a very particular kind of, how did I put it? Manifestation of geometry. I think I said it had something to do with an encounter with geometry whereby the two distort one another, whereby geometry becomes actualized. I don't remember how I put it, but there is something to that because our geometry is so immaterial, so much a mathematical and mental idea, of course, mental construct. And the question is how to bring it into being. I think it's somehow the intersection of geometry and the city. But it has to happen in a way that shapes the human experience of the city and of nature. This particular confluence, this particular conjunction of union of geometry and built reality that shapes our lives in a very particular way. This is what it has to be.
Wow.
Maybe it also shapes light as well, I should mention.
Yes, light is very important for you. How is the Preston Scott Cohen studio?
Oh, well, first and foremost, it is a collaboration with Carl Dworkin, who you know, absolutely remarkable figure. And we've been working together for about 10 years now. So we're every day intensely working out ideas. It's a conversation in which we finish each other's sentences. And then we have extended that to include many people. It's very much related also to my work at the GSD, my teaching. Bringing ideas from practice into teaching and teaching into practice, a continuous interchange of ideas. And the many brilliant and exciting specialists in the school, in so many remarkable people, so many different kinds of knowledge, so many different focuses with different kinds of knowledge that are introduced into that environment. We're doing many types of projects, from houses to sacred buildings, master plans, urban scale, and institutions like museums, libraries, and performing centers, all types. I think architecture is a way of thinking. It's not one type of building. It crosses all scales.
Okay. What architect you determine as mentor or as a view that you said, this is one architect that I can view it like the way I want to make architecture?
Oh. There are many great architects. I've already mentioned some of them to you. They all matter to me. The great classics matter to me. All of the great 20th century great architects. So, you know, when I was in school, the master architects just behind us, who had died just a couple of decades before I was in school, but still they were thriving in everyone's minds. They were Mies van der Rohe and Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, those great ones. But then there are the others that maybe even mattered more in very particular ways, like Adolf Loos, maybe Luigi Moretti. Moving forward, it may surprise you, but the distortions and complexities, the incredible subtlety of Venturi, of course, Kahn for the tectonic interests, and even some architects who rethought the city so powerfully, like Rossi and Caesar.
Okay.
I can't answer with only one mentor.
Yes,
and many others.
That's part of the question. And
I love also Scharoun, the great interior auditoriums of Scharoun.
Yes. Okay. What is the importance of innovation in your office?
Innovation. It's an interesting question. I don't know whether innovation is quite the right word. I would say transformation more than innovation. Working with things from the past and bringing them into the present and combining them in ways that maybe we haven't seen them combined before. It's an endless experiment.
Okay. In this moment that we are in pandemic, in the COVID-19, what is the importance you see in the networking at the architectural offices?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
In the networking, actually in this pandemic that we are turning to a networking type of working, what is in your office, in your experience of the office, what do you think that is going to happen in the architectural office
yes.
in this stage?
Well, I think the architectural office will be okay since we work digitally so much. And we have not been very focused on physical modeling. All of our work is modeled very intensely computationally. We look at constant changes and variations, and to be frozen by the labors of building physical models is something that only can slow us down. And we don't miss that. We do miss presence of people and the experience of thinking and sketching directly with one another. That's a very particular thing. But I think the bigger impact, of course, of the COVID is to rethink the cities and rethink the interiors of buildings and how will it play out. We are in a moment of limbo right now. We can't make any decisions about that yet, I believe. I think it would be premature to freeze buildings, to lock them into this configuration we're in right now socially, before we know whether there will be other ways to live within these, with the current conditions. So I don't know what will happen. There is, of course, the temporary situation we're in which some public spaces are being reshaped, streets are being thought about differently, even the way we move through buildings, the one-way movement I alluded to. But let's wait and see.
Okay.
thing could change everything.
What can you tell us about your experience working in China? We have seen a lot of projects that you are making in China. You have done projects in China. What is your experience working in China?
Well, that it's a long and interesting narrative. The China experience, seeing a city rapidly urbanizing and transforming its institutions when we began there in 2006, really offered incredible opportunities to resituate buildings. And now with planning new communities that are much more involved, much more about looking for sustainable ideas for urbanization. It's been an incredible experience to investigate all of it. You have to have a way of working there. With us, we have in our office a remarkable person, Yi Zhao. She has been with us, well, let's see now, it's getting to be maybe nearly 10 years also. And absolutely, you have to have someone of this depth of understanding to be able to work in a context so different than ours, with so many different political, protocols and so forth. He understands something which is almost impossible to do, I believe, which is to recognize the difference of thinking and understanding between cultures that are almost irreconcilable when it comes to architecture. Because, for example, the Chinese are speaking very vaguely and very imprecisely. There is a code for communicating about it, which is incompatible with the kind of specificity that we think is so important to have an impact architecturally. So she is constantly having to negotiate this highly precise language that we're trying to develop and, let's say, translate intellectually and literally and speak across that platform. It's pretty interesting. I'm struggling, of course, and regretful that we can't travel. That, of course, is difficult. And now with a terrible relationship being developed by our terrible administration, it really has become difficult. I don't know where we're heading vis-a-vis whether we will continue to be able to do a lot of work in China.
Okay, we have some questions that people are sending about in YouTube and Facebook. One question, we see that your design are characterized by atypical forms and geometries. What is the main value of using non-traditional forms in architecture?
Well, a lot of them are traditional insofar as they make a reference in a very specific way. So, for example, in the Tel Aviv Museum, the galleries are rectangular. They're very conventional, flexible rooms. In the case of the houses, the gable is a very strong element, a memory, a very powerful type to which they're referring. I don't think the projects are disconnected from tradition, but they have been shaped very specifically according to circumstances, according to the way we want to shape the experience inside or connect to the city. And those things, I think, sometimes require an exceptional approach. The value in that is to give it a singular beauty and not to have it be part of a formulaic repeating of past forms. I think shaping space uniquely can make it beautiful also, regardless of whether it's not so expensive or not so refined. I like the idea that the shape of space can create beautiful light and movement and experience and organization of life, so that we don't have to be always so focused on making the building so precious, so expensive, so rich. Now, it does cost money to build these irregular forms, but we've tried, and this is what Carl's discipline is so dedicated to. standardize these dynamic forms when we have dynamic forms.
Okay. Your work has been widely published and exhibited and held in numerous museum collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Copper Hewitt National Design Museum, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and the Fogg Museum of Art in Harvard. What is the important or message you want to show in these exhibitions to the students, to the architects of your work?
Well, I suppose the context of the museum is interesting when it comes to architecture because it gives you a different way to think about it. You're focused on drawings and models, this very particular translation of thought about it. That's different than when we're immersed in the experience of buildings, living with buildings. It's a different mode of attention that we put on those things. And we identify with the process of thought, for example, when we look at models and drawings. I guess I would just like that to give access to ideas, those pieces that are seen in those contexts. And they're put into curatorial arrangements with other works, so you can start to see the connections. I mean, the MoMA has done numerous exhibits where they create different narratives and they put the same work into different relationships with other projects. I like very much that idea.
Okay. What is the experience to teach in the university and teach at the interior of your office? What is that interaction between the being at the university and bringing all that knowledge to your office?
Well, the students, experimenting with the students, I think there's nothing as exciting as learning by surprise, by having that dialogue, you know, produce new forms and new ideas. I mean, even though they have something to do with my own obsessions, because I set up the project a certain way, they go off in new directions that are just not possible to anticipate. And then you're meeting these people who have brand new approaches and generationally, of course, really different values and interests. So it's that kind of movement of the thought and the sharing of ideas. I mean, that's what I love. And then we have the advancing technology in the school that alters the way we make things and model things. We're constantly adapting to that, and it's having an impact with everyone we bring into the office to work with us. It's very much a back and forth. The stimulation of going into the school and then coming back to the office, the two stimulate each other. I don't think I would want to ever be stuck only in one of the two.
Okay, wonderful. One last question, Scott. From your experience, what can you tell us about running an architectural office for new architects, new students that want to open an architectural office? What is your what you tell these people in this moment?
Well, for running an office, well, that's a different thing than, let's say, the experience of working in it. But if your goal is to run the office eventually on your own, I guess I would love to imagine that you would be compelled to do that because of a project, a design, an actual creation, you know, a kind of real problem that you want to build. I'm saying, for example, you have to build this house or you have to build this space, and whatever that is, you have to have an office to do it. You need people to collaborate with you on it, and that would be what opens the office. The creative component, it gets tightly, how should I say? It gets interfered with, as you know, by everything else in an office. We haven't expanded our office to the point where we have a big administrative component and a large team to manage. I think Carl and I just, frankly, it isn't suited to our sensibility. So we have kept it a very small office, and that means that when I walk in the door, I don't feel like I am being monitored by the manager of the office. You know, I actually believe that if I had one of those large offices, I would feel like an employee because I'm out of control. Carl and I, we waste a lot of time. We do designs that go off course. We do multiple designs. And so many hours are lost. We are very inefficient in that way, although he works more quickly than anybody I've ever heard in my life, seen. It doesn't have to do with how quickly you work. It's what you dedicate your time to doing. It's this tension between the design side and the managerial and business side that is difficult to resolve in practice, I think. I don't know how to advise you on that. I think you have to decide what you enjoy doing the most and find the context in which you get to spend the time you want to, the way you wish to. You have to find the office that meets your sensibility, suits your way of working in a way. It's not only the style of the work, it's the way the office is structured and socially functions. It's a tricky, it's not so easy to answer.
Okay. Thank you very much, Scott. It has been a very interesting talk. We wish you and your group, to Carl, the best, and want you to take care of yourself and be in good health in this pandemic.
Well, thank you so much.
A todos los seguidores, muchas gracias y los invitamos el próximo jueves 2 de julio al cuarto conversatorio de Arquitectura 2020 con el arquitecto Manuel Sánchez, que nos acompaña de la firma EICO. Les recordamos a todos que los conversatorios los pueden ver en la página de Facebook Live de la W. Todos los conversatorios van a estar colgados en la página de la W para que las personas que se perdieron cada conversatorio los puedan repetir y los puedan ver, digamos, cuando lleguen a su casa, cuando tengan un tiempo para ver. Muchas gracias a Construcciones Planificadas, la W Radio y a Grupo Aval por hacer factible tener este evento. Y a todos ustedes, muchas gracias y una feliz semana. Chao.